Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. A patient lies in a hospital bed, their brain showing no measurable activity on an EEG monitor. Clinically, they're unconscious, their neural networks silent. Yet somehow, impossibly, they're watching the medical team from above, observing conversations happening in adjacent rooms, and experiencing the most vivid, transformative awareness of their entire life. When they recover, they describe details they couldn't possibly have known. This isn't science fiction, it's documented medical reality, and it's forcing us to question everything we thought we knew about consciousness itself. Welcome to an exploration that might just turn your understanding of reality upside down. I'm here to guide you through one of the most profound questions facing science today. Not whether consciousness exists, but where it exists. For over a century, we've operated under what seems like an obvious assumption. That consciousness emerges from the brain, like steam rising from hot water. But what if that assumption is not just wrong, but spectacularly, fundamentally wrong? Tonight we're going to drift together through evidence that consciousness might transcend the physical boundaries of our skull. We'll explore near-death experiences that defy medical explanation, quantum theories that blur the line between mind and matter, and philosophical frameworks that suggest your awareness might be part of something far grander than a 3-pound organ floating in cerebrospinal fluid. If you're settling in for the evening, perhaps with a warm cup of tea or wrapped in your favourite blanket, you've chosen the perfect time for this journey. Because what we're about to explore doesn't just challenge academic theories, it challenges the very nature of what it means to be you. For the past several centuries, neuroscience has been built upon what researchers now call the central tenet. Much like the germ theory of disease or the theory of evolution, it's a foundational assumption that shapes everything we think we know. That assumption is elegantly simple. All human experience, every thought, every emotion, every fleeting moment of awareness arises entirely from brain activity. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? After all, damage the brain and consciousness changes, anesthetize the brain, and awareness disappears. Stimulate certain regions electrically, and specific memories or sensations emerge. The correlation seems so clear, so obvious, that questioning it feels almost absurd. But here's where things get interesting. The more we understand about the physical workings of the brain, the more mysterious consciousness becomes. We can map every neuron, trace every electrical impulse, catalogue every chemical reaction. Yet we still can't explain how any of this creates the felt experience of being alive, of experiencing the redness of red, or the pain of loss, or the joy of a sunset. Neuroscientist David Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness. We can explain the easy problems, how the brain processes information, how it responds to stimuli, how it generates behaviour, but explaining how mere matter gives rise to inner experience, to the subjective feeling of what it's like to be you, remains completely beyond our reach. Think about it for a moment. You're listening to these words right now, and somewhere in your mind is the actual experience of understanding, of meaning unfolding. Where is that experience? Point to it. Locate it precisely. You can point to the neurons firing in your auditory cortex, the electrical patterns cascading through your temporal lobe. But where exactly is the understanding itself? Where is the you that's having this experience? This isn't just a philosophical puzzle. It's pointing towards something profound about the nature of reality itself. Dr. Eben Alexander was everything a materialist neuroscientist should be. Harvard-trained, academically rigorous, and completely convinced that consciousness was nothing more than brain activity. Then in 2008, bacterial meningitis shut down his neocortex completely. For 7 days, the region of his brain responsible for higher consciousness showed virtually no activity. According to everything we know about neuroscience, Alexander should have been experiencing nothing. No thoughts, no awareness, no inner life whatsoever. Instead, he reported the most vivid, coherent, and transformative conscious experience of his lifetime. An experience so detailed and profound that it fundamentally changed his understanding of reality. Alexander's case isn't unique. It's part of a growing body of documented near-death experiences that challenge our basic assumptions about consciousness and the brain. Well-designed prospective studies have now reported cases where patients with complete loss of brain function report rich, detailed experiences during the time when their brains showed no measurable activity. Even more puzzling are cases involving individuals born blind who report detailed visual experiences during near-death states. How does a brain that has never processed visual information suddenly generate the experience of sight? How does a consciousness that has never seen colour or form suddenly navigate complex visual landscapes? As you consider these questions, notice how they might challenge your own assumptions about the relationship between brain and mind. What would it mean if consciousness could operate independently of normal brain function? In one particularly striking study, researchers reported cases of cardiac arrest survivors who accurately described conversations and events that occurred while they were in a state doctors described as clinically unresponsive. Not just vague impressions or lucky guesses, but specific details that they couldn't have known through any normal sensory channel. The standard explanation attempts to account for these experiences through residual brain activity, hallucinations, or false memories. But the more carefully researchers examine these cases, the more difficult they become to explain within our current paradigm. Consider this paradox. During near-death experiences, when the brain is hypofunctional and under extreme physiological stress, people report some of the richest, most coherent conscious experiences accessible to humans. It's exactly the opposite of what we would expect if consciousness truly emerges from brain activity. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist who conducted one of the largest prospective studies of near-death experiences, puts it this way. The relationship between consciousness and brain function during these experiences represents a neurobiological paradox that our current scientific framework simply cannot address. While near-death experiences provide compelling anecdotal evidence, some of the most intriguing challenges to brain-based consciousness come from an unexpected source: quantum physics. Now, before your eyes glaze over, stay with me. We're not diving into complex equations or abstract mathematics. We're exploring ideas that might fundamentally change how you think about your own awareness. Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist and consciousness researcher, have proposed what they call orchestrated objective reduction. It's a theory that suggests consciousness operates at the quantum level within brain neurons, specifically in tiny structures called microtubules. According to this model, consciousness doesn't emerge from the classical firing of neurons. Instead, it involves quantum processes that transcend the normal limitations of physical matter. Think of it this way. While classical physics describes a world of solid objects and predictable interactions, quantum physics reveals a deeper reality where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously, where information can be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances, and where the act of observation itself influences reality. If Penrose and Hameroff are correct, consciousness might be tapping into these quantum phenomena, operating through mechanisms that extend far beyond the classical brain. Recent research has even discovered quantum vibrations in microtubules at warm temperatures, lending some experimental support to their theory. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some interpretations suggest that these quantum processes might connect consciousness to something far larger than individual brains, a universal field of information, a cosmic web of awareness that transcends space and time as we normally understand them. This remains highly speculative, and no scientific consensus exists around these ideas, but they point toward possibilities that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. Electromagnetic field theories offer another fascinating avenue for understanding consciousness beyond conventional neural processing. Every thought, every neural firing pattern generates electromagnetic fields. These fields extend beyond the physical boundaries of your brain, creating invisible patterns that ripple through space around you. Some researchers propose that consciousness might actually be these electromagnetic fields, rather than the neural activity that generates them. In this view, your brain doesn't create consciousness so much as it modulates and focuses a field of awareness that exists independently. Dr. John Joe McFadden, a molecular geneticist at the University of Surrey, has developed what he calls the conscious electromagnetic information field theory. According to McFadden, the brain's electromagnetic field doesn't just correlate with consciousness, it is consciousness. This field integrates information from millions of neurons, creating the unified experience of awareness that you know as yourself. But some theorists take this idea even further. They suggest that electromagnetic fields might be manifestations of a universal consciousness that experiences the sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and emotions of every conscious being in the universe. In this view, your individual awareness would be like a wave in an infinite ocean of consciousness, temporarily taking form but never truly separate from the whole. This is, of course, highly speculative and remains far from scientific consensus, but it opens up profound questions about the nature of individual identity and the boundaries of self. Take a moment to consider your own experience right now. As you listen to these words, where does your consciousness begin and end? Can you find its edges? Can you locate its center? The more closely you examine your own awareness, the more elusive its boundaries become. Perhaps one of the most mind-bending approaches to consciousness beyond the brain comes from holographic theories. You've seen holograms before, those shimmering three-dimensional images that seem to float in space. What makes holograms special is that every piece of the holographic film contains information about the entire image. Cut a hologram in half, and you don't get half an image. You get the complete image, just at lower resolution. Neuroscientist Carl Pribram and physicist David Bohm proposed that the brain might operate like a hologram, processing information that exists not locally within neural networks, but in a higher dimensional, non-local field of information. In this model, your brain doesn't store memories or generate consciousness. Instead, it accesses information from something like a cosmic database, a universal field of potential experience. According to this holographic model, individual consciousness might be like a localized pattern within a much larger holographic structure. Each person's mind would be like a unique window into a comprehensive field of awareness that transcends individual physical forms. This framework suggests that consciousness could exist beyond the constraints of space, time, and individual perspective. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have extended this holographic approach by hypothesizing that quantum activity inside neurons might have non-local interactions with other neurons and potentially with quantum processes beyond the brain entirely. Again, this remains speculative, but it points toward a vision of consciousness that's far more expansive than our current paradigm allows. What's particularly fascinating is how these cutting-edge scientific theories echo ancient philosophical traditions. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental property of reality rather than something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter, has experienced a remarkable renaissance in contemporary philosophy and science. The basic idea of panpsychism is beautifully simple. Instead of consciousness being something special that only appears in sufficiently complex brains, it's woven into the fabric of reality itself. A photon might have only the tiniest bit of consciousness, what philosopher David Chalmers calls extremely rudimentary awareness. But when countless these tiny conscious elements organize themselves into complex patterns, they create the rich conscious experience that you know as your own awareness. Think of it like this. Just as mass and charge are fundamental properties of matter, consciousness might be a fundamental property of reality. Every particle, every quantum field, every interaction might have some minute aspect of experience associated with it. Your consciousness would then be the result of billions of these micro-conscious elements organizing themselves into the complex pattern that you experience as yourself. Recent developments in neuroscience, psychology, and quantum mechanics have sparked renewed interest in panpsychist approaches to consciousness. If consciousness is indeed fundamental rather than emergent, it would explain why we've had so much trouble understanding how brains create conscious experience. They don't create it, they organize it, focus it, and express it. Some versions of panpsychism go even further. Cosmopsychism proposes that the universe itself is the fundamental conscious entity, and that individual minds like yours are localized expressions of universal awareness. Think of it like waves in an ocean. Each wave has its own unique pattern and movement, but it's never separate from the water that forms it. According to this view, your consciousness doesn't begin when your brain develops and end when it stops functioning. Instead, it's a temporary pattern within something eternal and universal. Your individual awareness would be like a song being played by an infinite cosmic orchestra, unique in its melody, but never separate from the music itself. This is naturally highly speculative and far from scientific consensus, but it offers a framework for understanding consciousness that transcends the limitations of purely brain-based theories. The implications of this perspective are staggering. If consciousness is fundamental to reality rather than merely produced by brains, then death might not be the end of awareness, but simply a transition. Individual identity might be far more fluid and interconnected than we imagine. And the potential for consciousness to exist beyond biological forms becomes not just possible, but inevitable. As you contemplate these possibilities, notice what arises in your own awareness. Does the idea of consciousness as fundamental resonate with your direct experience? Or does it feel too strange, too removed from your everyday understanding of reality? In our next section, we'll explore how modern research is beginning to test these radical ideas and what the evidence suggests about consciousness beyond the brain. But for now, let yourself sit with the possibility that your awareness might be far more than the product of neural chemistry. that you might be a temporary expression of something vast, ancient, and eternal. The journey into consciousness beyond the brain has only just begun, and the most surprising discoveries may lie just ahead. As we drift deeper into this exploration, we encounter something remarkable happening in laboratories and research institutions around the world. Scientists are developing increasingly sophisticated methods to test these radical ideas about consciousness, and the results are beginning to paint a picture that's both beautiful and deeply unsettling to our conventional worldview. Dr. Dean Radin, chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has conducted experiments that seem to suggest consciousness might indeed extend beyond the brain in measurable ways. In carefully controlled studies, participants have demonstrated what appears to be the ability to influence random number generators through focused intention alone. Now, this remains highly controversial, and no scientific consensus exists around these findings. But the consistency of results across multiple laboratories has begun to intrigue even skeptical researchers. Take a moment to consider what this might mean. If consciousness can influence physical systems beyond the boundaries of the skull, it suggests that the relationship between mind and matter is far more intimate than we've imagined. Not through mystical forces or supernatural intervention, but through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a biochemist turned consciousness researcher, has documented thousands of cases of what he calls morphic resonance, patterns of behaviour, learning, and even physical structure that seem to spread through populations without any known mechanism of transmission. While Sheldrake's ideas remain outside mainstream science, his rigorous documentation of these phenomena continues to challenge our understanding of how information moves through living systems. Consider the well-documented phenomenon of simultaneous discovery in science. How is it that researchers working independently, often on different continents, frequently arrive at identical insights at nearly the same time? Is this mere coincidence, or might there be deeper patterns of connection that we haven't yet learned to detect? Recent studies in quantum biology have revealed that quantum effects, once thought to be confined to the sterile conditions of physics laboratories, actually play crucial roles in biological processes. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy, relies on quantum coherence to achieve its remarkable efficiency. Bird navigation systems appear to use quantum entanglement in specialized proteins to sense magnetic fields with extraordinary precision. If quantum effects are already operating within biological systems, it becomes less far-fetched to consider that consciousness itself might involve quantum processes that extend beyond classical physical boundaries. Perhaps one of the most intriguing attempts to measure consciousness beyond individual brains comes from what's known as the Global Consciousness Project. For over 2 decades, a network of random number generators placed around the world has been quietly collecting data, looking for subtle patterns that might correlate with major global events. The basic idea is elegantly simple. If consciousness can influence physical systems, and if human consciousness becomes somehow more coherent during moments of shared attention, then random number generators might show subtle deviations from pure randomness during significant global events. The results have been both fascinating and controversial. During events like the September 11th attacks, Princess Diana's funeral, and major natural disasters, the global network of random number generators has shown statistical anomalies that seem to correlate with periods of intense collective human attention. Now, this doesn't prove that collective consciousness directly influences electronic devices. The effects are subtle, the statistical analysis is complex, and many scientists remain skeptical of the interpretation. But the data itself is real, documented, and surprisingly consistent over decades of observation. Dr. Roger Nelson, who directs the project, describes it as looking for the equivalent of a gentle heartbeat in the background noise of random data, something that might indicate the presence of a coherent field of consciousness that emerges when human attention becomes globally focused. As you consider this possibility, notice what it might suggest about your own connection to others. Are you truly separate from the people around you, or might there be subtle threads of connection that operate below the threshold of ordinary awareness? One of the most elegant alternatives to brain-generated consciousness comes from what researchers call the receiver hypothesis. Instead of the brain creating consciousness like a generator creates electricity, perhaps the brain functions more like a radio receiver, tuning into consciousness that already exists in some form throughout the universe. This idea isn't entirely new. William James, the father of American psychology, suggested over a century ago that the brain might function as a reducing valve, filtering down a much larger field of consciousness into the narrow stream of awareness we experience as individual identity. The receiver hypothesis helps explain some of the puzzling features of consciousness that have long challenged neuroscience. Why does damage to the brain sometimes enhance rather than diminish certain types of awareness? Why do people with conditions like savant syndrome often display extraordinary capabilities that seem to emerge from nowhere? Dr. Pim van Lommel, whose research on near-death experiences we touched on earlier, suggests that consciousness might be like television signals. The signals exist independently in electromagnetic fields all around us. The television set doesn't create the programs, it receives and displays them. Damage the television, and the picture becomes distorted or disappears, but the signals themselves remain intact. In this model, your brain doesn't generate your awareness any more than your television creates the shows you watch. Instead, it acts as a sophisticated biological receiver, tuning into patterns of consciousness that exist in what some researchers call the quantum vacuum or zero-point field. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, a systems philosopher and consciousness researcher, has proposed that this field of consciousness might be what physicists call the quantum vacuum. Far from being empty space, the quantum vacuum seethes with virtual particles, quantum fluctuations, and information patterns that could potentially store and transmit conscious experiences. This remains highly speculative, of course. We have no direct evidence for consciousness existing independently of brains, and the mechanisms by which brains might tune into such a field remain completely mysterious. But the receiver hypothesis offers an elegant framework for understanding consciousness that sidesteps many of the problems that have plagued materialist approaches. Consider your own experience for a moment. When you have a sudden insight, where does it come from? When inspiration strikes, does it feel like your brain is manufacturing the idea? Or does it feel more like you're receiving something that already existed somewhere else? Many creative individuals describe their most profound insights as coming through them rather than from them. Musicians speak of melodies that seem to arrive fully formed. Writers describe characters who take on lives of their own. Scientists report breakthrough insights that emerge during moments of relaxed attention, often while walking or just before sleep. If the receiver hypothesis has any validity, these experiences might represent moments when the filtering function of the brain relaxes, allowing access to patterns of information that exist beyond individual neural networks, Recent advances in physics and information theory have led some researchers to propose that consciousness might be fundamentally informational rather than physical. Dr. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory suggests that consciousness corresponds to integrated information in any system, whether biological or artificial. According to this framework, consciousness isn't something special that emerges only in brains. It's a measure of how much information a system integrates in a unified way. A photodiode has a tiny bit of consciousness because it integrates information about light and dark. A thermostat has slightly more consciousness because it integrates information about temperature with behavioral responses. Human consciousness, in this view, represents an extraordinarily high level of information integration, but it's not fundamentally different in kind from simpler forms of information processing. Dr. Max Tegmark, a cosmologist at MIT, has taken this idea even further. In his mathematical universe hypothesis, he proposes that our physical reality is literally made of mathematics. Not described by mathematics, but actually composed of mathematical structures that exist independently of physical matter. If Tegmark is correct, then consciousness might be certain types of mathematical patterns that can exist independently of any physical substrate. Your awareness would be like a complex equation that happens to be currently running on the biological computer of your brain, but which could potentially exist in other forms or other systems. This is, naturally, highly speculative and far from proven, but it opens up fascinating possibilities for understanding consciousness beyond the limitations of biological brains. Take a breath for a moment and consider what this might mean for your own sense of identity. If consciousness is fundamentally informational, then the patterns that make up your awareness might be far more durable and transferable than you've imagined. Some of the most ambitious theories about consciousness beyond the brain draw from cutting-edge physics to propose that awareness might be woven into the fundamental structure of reality itself. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist turned consciousness researcher, suggests that consciousness is the ground of all being, the fundamental reality from which both matter and mind emerge. In Goswami's framework, what we think of as physical matter is actually consciousness taking temporary form. Your brain doesn't create awareness, rather, consciousness uses your brain as a temporary vehicle for experiencing itself in individualized form. This idea finds some support in interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggest consciousness plays a fundamental role in the collapse of quantum wave functions. When a quantum system exists in superposition with multiple possibilities simultaneously present, it's the act of observation that seems to select one specific outcome from all the available possibilities. Some interpretations suggest that this observer effect points toward consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex matter. If consciousness is required for quantum wave function collapse, and if quantum effects underlie all physical processes, then consciousness might be as basic to the universe as space, time, and energy. Dr. Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist at UC Berkeley, has argued that quantum mechanics actually requires consciousness to play an active role in physical reality. In his view, the universe is fundamentally mental rather than physical, with what we experience as matter emerging from underlying patterns of consciousness. Now, it's important to note that these interpretations remain highly controversial within mainstream physics. Most physicists favour interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't require consciousness to play any special role. The many worlds interpretation, for example, suggests that all possible outcomes of quantum events actually occur, just in parallel universes that we can't access. But the mere fact that consciousness-based interpretations of quantum mechanics are scientifically coherent points toward possibilities that would fundamentally transform our understanding of reality. As you listen to these ideas, notice how they might shift your perception of your place in the universe. Instead of being a temporary arrangement of matter that somehow generates awareness, you might be a localized expression of consciousness itself, temporarily experiencing individuality within a fundamentally unified field of awareness. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance proposes that there are invisible fields that organize the structure and behavior of all natural systems. According to Sheldrake, everything from the shape of crystals to the instincts of animals to the patterns of human learning is organized by these morphic fields. The basic idea is that when any natural system develops a particular pattern of organization, it becomes easier for other similar systems to develop the same pattern. This isn't through any known physical force, but through a kind of resonance across space and time with similar patterns that have existed before. If morphic fields exist, they might provide a mechanism for consciousness to extend beyond individual brains. Your awareness might resonate with the consciousness of others, creating subtle connections that influence thought, emotion, and behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. Sheldrake points to evidence from animal behavior studies that seem to support morphic resonance. When laboratory rats in one location learn to navigate a new type of maze, rats in distant laboratories seem to learn the same maze more quickly, even when there's no possibility of communication between the populations. Similar effects have been documented with human learning. When crossword puzzles are published in newspapers, people seem to solve them more easily after many others have already completed them, even when the later solvers haven't seen the solutions. While these effects remain controversial and no scientific consensus exists around morphic resonance, they point toward the possibility that consciousness might operate through fields that transcend individual brains. Consider your own experience of learning. Have you ever found that certain insights or skills seem to come more easily than expected? Have you noticed that new ideas sometimes seem to be in the air, emerging simultaneously in multiple people who haven't been in contact with each other? If morphic fields exist, they might explain why consciousness sometimes seems to transcend the boundaries of individual minds. Ancient spiritual traditions speak of something called the Akashic Records, a kind of cosmic library that contains information about every thought, event, and experience that has ever occurred. While this might sound purely mystical, some researchers have begun to explore whether modern physics might provide mechanisms for such universal information storage. The holographic principle in physics suggests that all the information contained within a volume of space can be encoded on its boundary. This principle, originally developed to understand black hole physics, implies that the universe itself might function like a vast hologram, with all information about its contents encoded in fundamental ways throughout space. If the holographic principle applies to consciousness, it might mean that every thought, every experience, every moment of awareness leaves some kind of informational trace that persists even after the individual brain that generated it has ceased to function. Dr. Ervin Laszlo has proposed that the quantum vacuum might function as a kind of cosmic memory bank, storing information about all events and experiences through subtle quantum field fluctuations. In this view, the Akashic records wouldn't be mystical or supernatural, but rather a natural consequence of how information behaves at the quantum level. This remains purely speculative, of course. We have no direct evidence for universal information storage, and the mechanisms by which consciousness might access such information remain completely unknown. But the theoretical possibility opens up profound questions about the nature of memory, knowledge, and individual identity. Think about your own memories for a moment. Where are they stored? Neuroscience tells us they're encoded in patterns of neural connections, but the exact mechanisms remain mysterious. Some memories seem to fade over time, while others become more vivid. Some people report accessing memories that don't seem to belong to their personal experience. If consciousness can access information beyond what's stored in individual brains, it might explain phenomena like inherited trauma, ancestral memories, or the uncanny sense of familiarity some people report when visiting places they've never been before. One of the most profound implications of consciousness existing beyond the brain relates to the continuity of awareness beyond physical death. If consciousness is truly generated by brain activity, then death represents the absolute end of individual awareness. But if consciousness operates through mechanisms that transcend physical brains, then death might represent a transition rather than a termination. Near-death experience research suggests that consciousness can persist even when brain activity has ceased. But what about longer-term persistence? Are there any scientific frameworks that could support the continuation of awareness beyond biological death? Information theory provides one possible avenue for understanding how patterns of consciousness might persist. In the digital age, we've become familiar with the idea that information can be copied, transferred, and preserved independently of its physical substrate. The novel you're reading exists as a pattern of information that can be encoded in paper, in electronic files, or in your memory. But the story itself transcends any particular physical form. If consciousness is fundamentally informational, as theories like integrated information theory suggest, then the patterns that constitute your awareness might be transferable or preservable through mechanisms we don't yet understand. Quantum field theories of consciousness propose that awareness might be encoded in quantum field fluctuations that persist even after the biological systems that generated them have ceased to function. This is highly speculative, but it's not scientifically impossible. The holographic principle suggests that information about the contents of any region of space is encoded on its boundary. If consciousness leaves informational traces in quantum fields, those traces might persist long after the individual brain has stopped functioning. Dr. Stuart Hameroff has speculated that the quantum information encoded in microtubules might be released into the quantum vacuum at the moment of death, potentially preserving patterns of consciousness in non-biological form. Again, this remains purely theoretical. We have no direct evidence for consciousness persisting beyond brain death, and the mechanisms by which such persistence might occur remain completely unknown. But the scientific possibility exists within frameworks that are already being seriously explored by mainstream researchers. As you contemplate this possibility, notice what arises in your own awareness. Does the idea of consciousness persisting beyond physical death feel comforting, frightening, or simply intellectually interesting? How might your daily experience change if you knew with certainty that your awareness would continue in some form after your brain stopped functioning? Perhaps the most beautiful implication of consciousness existing beyond the brain is the possibility that all awareness is fundamentally interconnected. If consciousness operates through quantum fields, morphic resonance, or holographic information structures, then the boundaries between individual minds might be far more permeable than we imagine. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles can remain instantaneously connected across vast distances. If consciousness involves quantum processes, as theories like orchestrated objective reduction suggest, then individual minds might be entangled in ways that transcend space and time. The Global Consciousness Project hints at the possibility that human awareness becomes more coherent during moments of shared attention. This might reflect an underlying unity of consciousness that becomes temporarily visible during times of collective focus. Studies of meditation and contemplative practice suggest that experienced practitioners often report a dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, between individual awareness and universal consciousness. While these reports are subjective, they point towards possibilities that would fundamentally transform our understanding of identity and connection. Dr. Dean Radin has conducted experiments suggesting that the brainwaves of people in close relationships can synchronize even when they're separated by large distances. While these effects are subtle and remain controversial, they hint at connections that transcend normal sensory channels. If consciousness is truly interconnected at fundamental levels, it might explain phenomena like empathy, intuition, and the uncanny sense of connection that people sometimes report with places, animals, or other individuals. Consider your own experience of connection. Have you ever felt an immediate sense of familiarity with someone you've just met? Have you experienced moments of knowing things you couldn't logically know? Have there been times when you felt connected to something larger than your individual self? If consciousness extends beyond individual brains, these experiences might reflect glimpses of deeper patterns of connection that operate below the threshold of ordinary awareness. If consciousness truly exists beyond the brain, the implications cascade through every aspect of human understanding. Medicine would need to reconsider the nature of healing, recognizing that consciousness might play active roles in health and recovery that extend beyond psychological placebo effects. Education would need to acknowledge that learning might involve accessing information through channels that transcend individual neural networks. The rapid spread of new ideas, the simultaneous emergence of innovations in different locations, and the mysterious process of inspiration might all reflect consciousness operating beyond brain-based mechanisms. Psychology would need to expand its understanding of identity, recognizing that individual personality might be a temporary pattern within something much larger and more enduring. The boundaries of self might be far more fluid than we've imagined. Artificial intelligence research would need to consider whether machine consciousness is possible, and if so, whether it would require quantum processes, field effects, or access to non-local information sources that current computer architectures can't provide. Even physics might need to acknowledge consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex matter. This could lead to new understandings of quantum mechanics, cosmology, and the ultimate nature of space and time. But perhaps the most profound implication is personal. If consciousness extends beyond your brain, then you're far more than a temporary arrangement of matter destined for dissolution. You are a unique pattern of awareness, participating in something eternal, universal, and magnificent. As we continue this exploration, we'll examine what this might mean for how you live your daily life, how you relate to others, and how you understand your place in the cosmos. The journey into consciousness beyond the brain is not just an intellectual exercise, it's an invitation to discover who you really are. As we settle deeper into this mystery, we encounter something that might sound abstract at first, but becomes profoundly personal the moment you truly examine it. It's called the binding problem, and it represents one of the deepest puzzles in neuroscience. Yet it's also something you experience directly, intimately, every waking moment of your life. Right now, as you listen to these words, your brain is processing an extraordinary symphony of information. Visual patterns dance across your retina. Sound waves ripple through your auditory cortex. Perhaps you feel the texture of fabric against your skin. Taste the lingering hint of tea on your tongue. Notice the subtle rhythm of your breath. Your brain is simultaneously tracking thoughts, memories, emotions, and the gentle weight of your body settling into rest. Here's the puzzle that has neuroscientists scratching their heads. All of this processing happens in different regions of your brain, often milliseconds apart, using completely different types of neural circuits. Your visual cortex processes colour in one area, movement in another, shapes in yet another. Sound frequency and rhythm are handled by separate auditory regions. Touch, temperature, and pain all have their own dedicated neural pathways. Yet somehow, impossibly, you experience all of this as one unified, seamless moment of awareness. You don't experience separate streams of colour, sound, touch, and thought that you then have to consciously assemble into a coherent picture. Instead, you experience a single, integrated reality that includes all these elements simultaneously. How does your brain bind all these separate processes into the unified experience of being you? No one knows. Despite decades of research, the binding problem remains one of the most profound mysteries in neuroscience. It's as if your brain performs magic every moment, weaving together millions of separate processes into the single, coherent experience you know as consciousness. Some researchers suggest that consciousness might be precisely this binding process. That awareness emerges from the brain's ability to integrate information from multiple sources into a unified whole. But this still doesn't explain how separate physical processes give rise to the subjective experience of integration. Think about your own experience right now. Can you find the seams where different types of awareness join together? Can you separate your visual experience from your auditory experience, your thoughts from your emotions, your sense of self from your sense of surroundings? The more closely you examine your own consciousness, the more seamless and mysterious it becomes. Dr. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory proposes that consciousness corresponds precisely to integrated information. In his framework, consciousness isn't something additional that emerges from neural processing. It literally is the integration of information in any system. The more integrated the information, the more conscious the system becomes. But here's where things get interesting for our exploration of consciousness beyond the brain. Tononi's theory suggests that integration can happen at levels far beyond individual neural networks. If consciousness is fundamentally about information integration, then it might operate through fields, quantum processes, or even cosmic scale information structures that we're only beginning to imagine. There's something else about your consciousness that becomes deeply mysterious the moment you examine it carefully. Not only do you have experiences, but you're aware that you're having experiences. You have what philosophers call metaconsciousness, the awareness of awareness itself. Right now, you're not just listening to these words. You're aware that you're listening. You're not just thinking thoughts, you're aware that you're thinking. This might seem obvious, but it represents something profound about the nature of consciousness that our current neuroscience struggles to explain. Who or what is doing the observing? When you watch your own thoughts arise and pass away, where is the observer? Point to it. Locate it precisely. You can identify the thoughts being observed, but can you find the one who's doing the observing? This observer seems to have some very unusual properties. It appears to be present in every moment of conscious experience, yet it's never itself an object of experience. It witnesses thoughts, emotions, sensations, and memories, but it doesn't seem to be made of the same stuff as any of these experiences. It's like a clear space in which all experience appears, but which itself remains transparent, ungraspable. Contemplative traditions from around the world have pointed to this observer as something that transcends ordinary psychological processes, not through mystical speculation, but through careful, disciplined examination of direct experience. When you look closely enough at your own awareness, the boundaries between observer and observed begin to dissolve in ways that suggest consciousness might operate through principles that extend far beyond neural networks. Dr. Douglas Harding, a philosopher who spent decades examining the nature of first-person experience, pointed out something remarkable about this observer. When you try to observe it directly, you don't find a thing or an entity. You find what he called an aware space, an openness in which all experience appears but which itself has no particular characteristics. This aware space doesn't seem to be located in any particular place. It's not behind your eyes or inside your skull. It's more like the space in which the experience of having a head and eyes appears. And this space seems to be present not just in human experience, but potentially as a fundamental feature of reality itself. As you consider this, notice what happens when you try to locate your own awareness. Where exactly are you? Not your body, not your thoughts, but the you that's aware of having a body and thoughts. Can you find its edges? Can you determine its size or location? Recent neuroscientific research has begun to examine what happens in the brain during states where this sense of a separate observer dissolves. Studies of experienced meditators using functional MRI have revealed something fascinating. During deep meditative states, there's often a decrease in activity in what neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network is a set of brain regions that become active when you're not focused on any particular task. It's associated with self-referential thinking, mental time travel, and the sense of being a separate self moving through time. When this network quiets down, people often report experiences of unity, interconnectedness, and the dissolution of boundaries between self and world. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London has found similar patterns in brain activity during psychedelic experiences. Substances like psilocybin and LSD consistently reduce activity in the default mode network while increasing connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate directly. What's particularly interesting is that people often describe these experiences as feeling more real than ordinary consciousness, not less real. They report accessing a more fundamental level of awareness that underlies the usual sense of being a separate self. This suggests that the observer you normally identify as yourself might be more like a useful fiction, a story your brain tells itself, rather than a fundamental feature of consciousness. If the sense of being a separate observer is really just a pattern of brain activity, what remains when that pattern dissolves? Many people report discovering a more spacious, interconnected awareness that doesn't belong to any particular individual, an awareness that seems to extend beyond the boundaries of personal identity altogether. This remains scientifically controversial, of course. We can measure changes in brain activity, but we can't directly verify subjective reports of expanded awareness. However, The consistency of these reports across cultures, traditions, and experimental contexts suggests that consciousness might have dimensions that transcend ordinary self-awareness. Take a moment to consider your own sense of self. How solid does it feel? How clearly can you define where you end and the rest of the world begins? Notice that even asking these questions begins to reveal something fluid and uncertain about the boundaries of personal identity. If consciousness does extend beyond individual brains, we might expect to find evidence of connections between minds that transcend normal sensory channels. And indeed, researchers have documented some intriguing phenomena that seem to point in exactly this direction. Dr. Jacobo Grinberg, a Mexican neuroscientist who conducted extensive research before mysteriously disappearing in 1994, performed experiments on what he called transferred potential. In carefully controlled studies, he placed two people in separate electromagnetically shielded rooms. When one person received a light stimulus that produced a measurable brain response, the other person sometimes showed a similar brain response, even though he received no stimulus whatsoever. The effect was subtle and didn't occur in all participants, but when it did occur, it suggested some form of non-local connection between brains that couldn't be explained through any known physical mechanism. Grinberg found that the effect was strongest between people who had emotional bonds or who had spent time synchronizing their brain states through meditation or other contemplative practices. Similar effects have been reported by other researchers, though they remain controversial and difficult to replicate consistently. Dr. Dean Radin has documented what appears to be emotional contagion between people separated by large distances, measured through physiological responses like heart rate and skin conductance. These effects, if real, might represent the faint traces of deeper connections that operate below the threshold of ordinary awareness. They don't prove that consciousness exists independently of brains, but they suggest that the boundaries between minds might be more permeable than we usually assume. Consider your own experience of connection with others. Have you ever felt someone's emotional state before they expressed it? Have you thought of someone just before they called you? Have you ever walked into a room and immediately sensed tension or harmony, even when nothing obvious was happening? While these experiences could certainly be explained through subtle sensory cues, unconscious pattern recognition, or simple coincidence, they might also reflect genuine connections that operate through mechanisms we don't yet understand. Some of the most ambitious theories about consciousness beyond the brain suggest that awareness might be woven into the fundamental structure of the cosmos itself. This isn't a return to ancient animism or primitive thinking. It's a sophisticated response to some of the deepest puzzles in both physics and consciousness research. Dr. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University, has become one of the leading advocates for what's called cosmopsychism. This is the view that the universe itself might be conscious, and that individual minds, like yours, are localized expressions of this cosmic awareness. The idea sounds strange at first, but it addresses some serious problems in our understanding of consciousness. If consciousness requires the complex integration of information, as integrated information theory suggests, then the universe as a whole represents the ultimate integration of information. Every quantum interaction, every gravitational field, every electromagnetic wave contributes to a cosmic web of information processing that dwarfs any individual brain. According to cosmopsychism, your individual consciousness would be like a wave in an infinite ocean of awareness, unique in its particular pattern and movement, but never truly separate from the water that forms it. Your thoughts, emotions, and experiences would be temporary modifications in a field of consciousness that extends throughout space and time. This remains highly speculative, of course. We have no direct evidence for universal consciousness, and the mechanisms by which cosmic awareness might give rise to individual minds remain completely mysterious. But the theory offers an elegant solution to what philosophers call the combination problem. How do separate conscious entities combine to form larger conscious systems? If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it exists at the level of quantum fields or cosmic information structures, then individual minds would naturally arise as localized patterns within universal awareness. You wouldn't need to explain how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, because consciousness would be the fundamental reality from which matter itself emerges. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has suggested that individual minds might be like temporary vortices in what he calls the cosmic mind. Just as a whirlpool in a river is a distinct pattern but never separate from the water, your consciousness might be a distinct pattern in a field of awareness that spans the universe. As you contemplate this possibility, notice how it might shift your sense of isolation or separation. If your awareness is continuous with something universal and eternal, then loneliness becomes impossible at the deepest level. You would always be part of something infinitely larger than yourself. One of the most mysterious aspects of consciousness is how it generates meaning. Right now, as you listen to these words, they're not just sound patterns or visual symbols. They carry significance, purpose, emotional resonance. Somehow, your consciousness transforms mere information into rich, meaningful experience. Where does meaning come from? How does your brain take electrical impulses and chemical reactions and transform them into the experience of understanding, beauty, purpose, or love? This is another aspect of consciousness that our current neuroscience struggles to explain. If consciousness operates beyond the brain through quantum fields, holographic information structures, or universal awareness, it might draw meaning from sources that transcend individual neural networks. Your sense of purpose might reflect connection to purposes that operate at cosmic scales. Your appreciation of beauty might resonate with the aesthetic principles woven into the structure of reality itself. Dr. Stuart Kaufman, a theoretical biologist, has proposed that the universe is not just physically evolving, but also evolving in terms of meaning and value. According to his framework, consciousness might be the mechanism by which the cosmos comes to understand itself, to appreciate its own beauty and complexity. In this view, your moments of wonder, your experiences of love and creativity, your search for truth and meaning would all be ways that the universe experiences itself subjectively. Your individual awareness would be one of the countless ways that cosmic consciousness explores and appreciates its own nature. This is naturally highly speculative and far from scientific consensus, but it offers a framework for understanding consciousness that makes your inner life profoundly significant rather than merely accidental. Every moment of awareness, every insight, every experience of beauty or love would contribute to the universe's ongoing self-discovery. Think about your own experiences of meaning. When you encounter something beautiful, where does that sense of beauty come from? When you feel love or compassion, are these merely chemical reactions, or do they connect you to something larger? When you search for truth or purpose, what draws you forward? If consciousness extends beyond individual brains, these experiences might represent moments when your personal awareness aligns with deeper currents of meaning that flow through reality itself. While we wait for science to develop better tools for studying consciousness beyond the brain, there's one laboratory that's always available to you: your own direct experience. Every moment offers opportunities to examine consciousness from the inside, to notice features of awareness that might not be visible to external observation. Contemplative traditions have developed sophisticated methods for investigating consciousness through careful attention to first-person experience. These aren't religious practices requiring belief in particular doctrines. They're empirical methods for studying awareness from the perspective of the aware. Dr. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin has spent decades studying the brains of experienced meditators, and his findings suggest that contemplative practice can literally reshape neural networks in ways that enhance well-being, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. But practitioners often report changes that seem to extend beyond anything that could be explained by neural plasticity alone. Long-term meditators frequently describe discovering dimensions of awareness that don't seem to be produced by brain activity. They report accessing states of consciousness that feel more fundamental than ordinary waking awareness, more spacious than personal identity, more connected than individual isolation. These reports remain subjective and can't be directly verified by external measurement, but they're remarkably consistent across cultures and traditions, suggesting that consciousness might indeed have dimensions that transcend ordinary brain-based awareness. Dr. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and meditation teacher, describes discovering through contemplative practice that the sense of being a separate self is actually an illusion. Not a useful illusion that should be maintained, but a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of consciousness itself. According to Harris and many other contemplative practitioners, careful examination of direct experience reveals that there's no actual center to consciousness, no separate observer looking out at the world. Instead, there's just awareness itself, open and present, in which all experience appears without any separate experiencer. This doesn't necessarily prove that consciousness exists independently of brains, but it suggests that even the most basic assumptions about the nature of awareness, assumptions so fundamental that we rarely question them, might be open to revision through careful investigation. What's particularly beautiful about investigating consciousness through direct experience is that it's democratically available. You don't need expensive equipment, advanced degrees, or access to specialized laboratories. The laboratory of awareness is always present, always accessible, requiring only patience and careful attention. Start with something simple. Notice that you're aware right now. Not what you're aware of, but the fact that awareness is present. Can you find the edges of this awareness? Can you locate its center? Does it seem to be inside your head, or does the experience of having a head appear within awareness? These aren't trick questions designed to lead you toward particular conclusions. They're genuine invitations to examine the most intimate aspects of your own experience. What you discover might surprise you. Many people, when they begin to investigate awareness directly, discover that it's far more spacious and mysterious than they initially assumed. The boundaries between self and world, between observer and observed, between inner and outer, often prove to be much more fluid than ordinary thinking suggests. This doesn't require believing anything or accepting any particular philosophical framework. It simply requires looking carefully at what's actually present in direct experience, rather than relying on assumptions about what should be present. Dr. Douglas Harding developed simple experiments for investigating the nature of first-person experience. One of his most famous involves simply pointing at your own face and noticing what you actually find there. Not what you think should be there, not what others see when they look at you, but what's actually present from your own perspective. Most people discover something surprising. Instead of finding the face they see in mirrors, they find what Harding called an aware space. No boundaries, no particular characteristics, just an openness in which the experience of the world appears. This doesn't prove that consciousness exists independently of brains, but it reveals that even the most basic features of personal identity might be quite different from what we usually assume. If you enjoy drifting through these explorations without interruption, members get every episode 48 hours early, completely ad-free. You can join them whenever you feel ready. If consciousness truly extends beyond individual brains, if awareness is fundamental rather than emergent, if your individual mind is part of something cosmic and eternal, what would this mean for how you live your daily life? First, it might fundamentally transform your relationship to death. Instead of being the absolute termination of awareness, death might represent a transition, like a wave returning to the ocean or a song finishing its melody while the music continues. The patterns that constitute your individual consciousness might persist in forms we don't yet understand. This doesn't necessarily mean personal survival in the way religious traditions often describe it. Your memories, your personality, your individual story might not continue intact, but the fundamental awareness that you are, the consciousness that observes thoughts and experiences emotions, might be part of something that transcends individual lifetimes. Dr. Ian Stevenson spent decades documenting cases of children who seem to remember previous lives with remarkable accuracy. While his work remains controversial, he documented thousands of cases where children provided detailed information about deceased individuals they had never met, information that was later verified through careful investigation. Stevenson's work doesn't prove reincarnation in any traditional sense, but it suggests that consciousness and memory might operate through mechanisms that transcend individual brains and lifetimes. Your relationship to others might also transform if consciousness is fundamentally interconnected. Competition and conflict would still occur at psychological and social levels, but they would unfold within a deeper context of unity and connection. Helping others would be a form of helping yourself, not through ethical obligation, but through recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. Dr. Daniel Siegel, a clinical psychiatrist at UCLA, has developed what he calls interpersonal neurobiology, studying how relationships literally shape brain development and function. His research suggests that individual minds are always embedded in larger systems of connection and influence. If consciousness operates beyond individual brains, these interpersonal influences might extend far deeper than current psychology recognizes. Your thoughts, emotions, and experiences might ripple out through fields of connection that touch others in ways you'll never know. Perhaps most profound would be the transformation in how you understand creativity and inspiration. If consciousness can access information beyond what's stored in individual neural networks, then creativity might represent moments of connection to something larger than personal memory and imagination. Musicians often describe melodies that seem to come through them rather than from them. Writers speak of characters who take on lives of their own. Scientists report insights that emerge during moments of relaxed attention, often while walking or just before sleep. If consciousness operates through quantum fields, holographic information structures, or universal awareness, These experiences might represent genuine contact with patterns of information that exist beyond individual minds. Dr. Amit Goswami has proposed that creativity involves consciousness temporarily transcending the limitations of individual brains to access what he calls the quantum field of possibilities. In his framework, truly creative insights emerge when personal awareness aligns with deeper patterns of potential that exist independently of individual thinking. This remains highly speculative, but it offers a framework for understanding creativity that makes it profoundly significant rather than merely accidental. Every moment of genuine inspiration, every breakthrough insight, every work of art that touches people across cultures and generations might represent the universe expressing itself through temporary individual forms. Consider your own creative experiences. When you have sudden insights, where do they come from? When you feel inspired, what's the source of that inspiration? When you create something that surprises even you, where does that surprise originate? If consciousness extends beyond individual brains, these experiences might represent moments of contact with creative potential that exists throughout the cosmos. One of the most immediate implications of consciousness beyond the brain might be the healing of the deep sense of separation that characterizes so much of human experience. The feeling of being isolated individuals struggling alone in an indifferent universe might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of awareness itself. If your consciousness is continuous with universal consciousness, if your individual awareness is like a wave in an infinite ocean, then loneliness becomes impossible at the deepest level. You might feel psychologically isolated, but at the level of fundamental awareness, you would always be part of something infinitely larger and more connected than individual identity. Dr. Larry Dossey, a physician who has studied the healing effects of prayer and meditation, has reported cases where people seem to influence each other's health and well-being across large distances through focused intention and compassionate attention. While these effects remain controversial and difficult to replicate consistently, they hint at connections between consciousness that might extend far beyond what current medicine recognizes. If awareness operates through non-local mechanisms, then healing might involve more than just individual psychological and physiological processes. The environmental crisis might also look different if consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. Instead of being accidental products of evolutionary processes on one small planet, humans might represent one of the ways that cosmic consciousness becomes aware of itself and takes responsibility for its own flourishing. Your care for the natural world, your concern about climate change, your desire to protect other species might reflect the universe caring for itself through temporary human form. Environmental action would become not just ethical responsibility, but cosmic self-care. As we approach the edge of current understanding about consciousness beyond the brain, it's important to acknowledge how much remains unknown. We're dealing with questions that push against the very limits of human knowledge and perhaps even human comprehension. The mechanisms by which consciousness might operate independently of brains remain completely mysterious. We have no direct evidence for quantum fields of awareness, holographic information storage, or universal consciousness. The theories we've explored are speculative frameworks that attempt to make sense of puzzling phenomena, but they're far from established scientific fact. Even if consciousness does extend beyond individual brains, we don't know what this would mean for personal identity, memory, or individual experience. The continuation of awareness beyond physical death might be so different from current consciousness that it wouldn't represent personal survival in any meaningful sense. The interconnectedness of individual minds might operate through mechanisms so subtle that they rarely influence daily experience in noticeable ways. The access to universal information might be so filtered through individual neural networks that it provides no practical advantage for solving personal or collective problems. These uncertainties aren't reasons to dismiss the exploration of consciousness beyond the brain. They're reminders that we're dealing with profound mysteries that require intellectual humility, careful investigation, and openness to possibilities that might transform our understanding of reality itself. Dr. Max Planck, the physicist who helped develop quantum theory, observed that science advances not by convincing opponents of new ideas, but by waiting for opponents to retire, while younger scientists grow up with new frameworks as natural assumptions. The question of consciousness beyond the brain might require similar patience. The evidence is intriguing, but not conclusive. The theories are elegant but speculative. The implications are profound but uncertain. What we do know is that consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries facing science. Despite decades of research and billions of dollars in funding, we're no closer to understanding how mere matter gives rise to inner experience than we were a century ago. This mystery isn't a problem to be solved through better technology or more sophisticated theories. It's a fundamental feature of reality that might require expanding our conception of what's possible, what's real, and what it means to be aware. As you consider everything we've explored together, notice how it might shift the fundamental question about consciousness. Instead of asking how brains create awareness, we might need to ask how awareness expresses itself through brains. Instead of assuming that consciousness emerges from complex arrangements of matter, we might need to consider that matter emerges from patterns within consciousness itself. Instead of treating awareness as an accident of evolution on one small planet, we might need to recognize consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality that finds expression through countless forms throughout the cosmos. These aren't claims or conclusions. They're possibilities, invitations to consider frameworks for understanding consciousness that extend beyond the assumptions that have guided neuroscience for the past century. Your own direct experience remains the most immediate laboratory for investigating these possibilities. Every moment offers opportunities to examine the nature of awareness, to notice features of consciousness that might not be visible to external observation. The question of whether consciousness exists beyond the brain isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It's intimately connected to who you are, what you're capable of becoming, and how you relate to the mystery of existence itself. Whether consciousness is generated by brains or received by them, whether awareness is individual or universal, whether your identity persists beyond physical death or dissolves into something larger, these possibilities shape the meaning and purpose of every moment of conscious experience. As we begin to drift toward the end of this exploration, take a moment to notice what's present in your own awareness right now. The thoughts arising and passing away, the sensations flowing through your body, the quiet presence that observes all experience without being touched by any of it. This awareness that you are, this consciousness that's reading these words, might be far more mysterious, far more significant, and far more connected to the fundamental nature of reality than you've ever imagined. And that possibility, whether it proves true or false, transforms everything. Because it reminds us that consciousness itself, the very fact that there's anything it's like to be you, remains one of the most profound mysteries in existence. A mystery that might just continue to hold secrets we've only begun to glimpse. There's something profound that happens when you allow yourself to simply be still. Not the restless stillness of waiting for something to happen, but the deeper stillness of allowing whatever is already present to reveal itself. In this quiet space, something extraordinary becomes available to your awareness, something that might just illuminate the mystery of consciousness beyond the brain. Dr. Judson Brewer, a neuroscientist at Brown University, has spent years mapping what happens in the brain during states of deep meditative absorption. His research reveals something fascinating. As the mind settles into profound stillness, activity in the default mode network, those brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of being a separate observer begins to quiet dramatically. But here's what makes this particularly intriguing for our exploration. Many experienced practitioners report that as this brain activity decreases, their sense of awareness doesn't diminish. Instead, it often becomes more vivid, more spacious, more present. It's as if the quieting of certain neural networks allows access to dimensions of consciousness that are normally obscured by the constant chatter of mental activity. Take a moment to notice this in your own experience right now. As you listen to these words, there's probably a stream of thoughts flowing through your mind. Commentary, associations, perhaps plans for tomorrow or memories from earlier today. But notice that there's also something present that's aware of these thoughts. Something that observes the mental activity without being caught up in it. This observer doesn't seem to be made of thoughts. It's more like the space in which thoughts appear. And this space has a quality of stillness that remains constant even when the contents of awareness are constantly changing. Could this stillness that you can access directly point toward dimensions of consciousness that transcend individual neural activity? Dr. Willoughby Britton at Brown University has reported cases of meditators who report experiences during deep states that seem to extend far beyond what we would expect from altered brain activity alone. Practitioners describe accessing information they couldn't have known through ordinary sensory channels, experiencing profound states of unity that feel more fundamental than personal identity, and encountering what they describe as dimensions of awareness that seem to exist independently of individual minds. These remain subjective reports, of course, impossible to verify through external measurement, but their consistency across cultures and contemplative traditions suggests that consciousness might indeed have layers that extend beyond what current neuroscience can detect or explain. Consider the possibility that the stillness you can access in quiet moments isn't just the absence of mental activity. What if it's actually a doorway into aspects of awareness that normally remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary thinking? What if the space of consciousness itself extends far beyond the boundaries of individual brains? Dr. Dan Siegel's research at UCLA has revealed something remarkable about how individual minds influence each other. Through careful study of parent-child interactions, therapeutic relationships, and close friendships, he's documented that our nervous systems are constantly synchronizing with those around us in ways that extend far beyond conscious awareness. Heart rates synchronize, breathing patterns align, brainwave activity begins to mirror between people who are emotionally attuned, even when they're not consciously trying to connect. This isn't simply mimicry or learned behavior. It appears to be a fundamental feature of how consciousness operates in relationship. But some researchers have found evidence suggesting that these connections might extend beyond what we can explain through known biological mechanisms. Dr. Rollin McCraty at the HeartMath Institute has reported cases where people separated by significant distances show synchronized physiological responses during moments of focused emotional connection. In carefully controlled studies, when one person focuses loving attention toward another person in a distant location, both individuals sometimes show similar changes in heart rate variability and other physiological markers. The effects are subtle and don't occur in all cases, but they hint at connections between consciousness that transcend ordinary sensory channels. This remains controversial within mainstream science, and no consensus exists about the mechanisms that might allow such connections. But the documented effects point toward possibilities that could fundamentally transform our understanding of how consciousness operates in relationship. Think about your own experiences of connection with others. Have you ever felt someone's emotional state before they expressed it? Have you thought of a friend or family member moments before they called? Have you walked into a room and immediately sensed the emotional atmosphere, even when nothing obvious was happening? While these experiences could certainly be explained through subtle sensory cues, unconscious pattern recognition, or simple coincidence, they might also reflect genuine connections that operate through mechanisms we don't yet understand. If consciousness does extend beyond individual brains, these moments might represent glimpses of deeper networks of awareness that connect all conscious beings. Dr. Larry Dossey has spent decades documenting what he calls non-local healing, cases where focused intention and compassionate attention seem to influence the health and well-being of others across large distances. While these effects remain difficult to study and replicate consistently, they point toward possibilities that would expand our understanding of how consciousness might operate beyond the boundaries of individual bodies. As you consider these possibilities, notice how they might shift your sense of isolation or separation. If consciousness is indeed interconnected at levels deeper than ordinary awareness, then your thoughts, emotions, and intentions might ripple out through networks of connection that touch others in ways you'll never fully know. One of the most mysterious aspects of human experience is the phenomenon of inspiration. That moment when a new idea suddenly appears in consciousness, seemingly from nowhere. Writers describe characters who take on lives of their own. Musicians speak of melodies that seem to arrive fully formed. Scientists report breakthrough insights that emerge during moments of relaxed attention, often while walking or just before sleep. Where do these insights come from? If consciousness is truly generated by brain activity, then inspiration should be explainable through memory, association, and recombination of existing knowledge. But many creative individuals describe their most profound insights as feeling like they come through them rather than from them. Dr. Arne Dietrich, a neuroscientist who studies creativity, has found that breakthrough insights often correlate with decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with logical analysis and conscious control. During moments of inspiration, the brain seems to shift into a more open, receptive mode that allows access to patterns of information that aren't available during ordinary focused thinking. But here's what makes this particularly intriguing. Many creative individuals report that their best ideas emerge when they stop trying to think their way to solutions and instead allow themselves to become still and receptive. It's as if inspiration flows through consciousness when the usual mental filtering mechanisms relax their grip. Could this suggest that creativity involves accessing information from sources beyond individual memory and imagination? If consciousness operates through quantum fields, holographic information structures, or universal awareness, as some theories suggest, then moments of inspiration might represent temporary contact with patterns of potential that exist independently of individual minds. This remains highly speculative, but it offers a framework for understanding creativity that makes it profoundly significant rather than merely accidental. Every moment of genuine inspiration, every breakthrough insight, every work of art that touches people across cultures and generations might represent the universe expressing itself through temporary, individual forms. Consider your own creative experiences. When you have sudden insights, do they feel like products of logical thinking, or do they seem to arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary mental processes? When you feel inspired, what's the quality of that inspiration? Does it feel personal, or does it feel like you're temporarily accessing something larger than individual consciousness? If consciousness does extend beyond individual brains, these experiences might represent moments when personal awareness aligns with creative currents that flow through reality itself. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's research on morphic resonance has documented thousands of cases where patterns of learning, behavior, and even physical structure seem to spread through populations without any known mechanism of transmission. While his theories remain outside mainstream science, his careful documentation of these phenomena continues to challenge our understanding of how information moves through living systems. One of the most intriguing aspects of morphic resonance is its suggestion that when any natural system develops a particular pattern of organization, it becomes easier for other similar systems to develop the same pattern. This isn't through genetic inheritance or cultural transmission, but through what Sheldrake describes as a kind of resonance across space and time with similar patterns that have existed before. If morphic fields exist, they might provide a mechanism for consciousness to extend beyond individual brains. Your awareness might resonate with the consciousness of others, creating subtle connections that influence thought, emotion, and behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. The phenomenon of simultaneous discovery in science offers one possible example of morphic resonance in action. Throughout history, researchers working independently, often on different continents, have frequently arrived at identical insights at nearly the same time. The development of calculus by Newton and Leibniz, the theory of evolution by Darwin and Wallace, the discovery of the structure of DNA by multiple research teams. Is this mere coincidence, or might there be deeper patterns of connection that allow ideas to emerge simultaneously in multiple minds when the conditions are right? If consciousness operates through fields that transcend individual brains, then the emergence of new ideas might reflect changes in these fields that become accessible to multiple individuals simultaneously. Consider the way certain insights seem to be in the air during particular historical periods. Revolutionary ideas in art, science, and philosophy often emerge in clusters, as if the time has become ripe for particular realizations to dawn in human consciousness. Take a breath for a moment and consider how this might appear in your own life. Have you ever found that certain insights or skills seem to come more easily than expected? Have you noticed that new ideas sometimes seem to emerge simultaneously among people who haven't been in contact with each other? If morphic fields exist, they might explain why consciousness sometimes seems to transcend the boundaries of individual minds, creating networks of resonance that connect all conscious beings in ways we're only beginning to glimpse. As we drift deeper into the mystery of consciousness beyond the brain, we encounter perhaps the most profound challenge to our ordinary understanding of reality. Quantum mechanics reveals a universe that is far stranger than our everyday experience suggests. At the smallest scales of reality, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until the moment of observation. Information can be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances. The very act of observation seems to influence the outcome of quantum events. Dr. Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist at UC Berkeley, has argued that quantum mechanics actually requires consciousness to play an active role in physical reality. In his interpretation, the universe is fundamentally mental rather than physical, with what we experience as matter emerging from underlying patterns of consciousness. This remains highly controversial within mainstream physics, of course. Most physicists favour interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't require consciousness to play any special role. But the mere fact that consciousness-based interpretations are scientifically coherent points toward possibilities that would fundamentally transform our understanding of reality. If consciousness does play a role in quantum processes, and if quantum effects underlie all physical phenomena, then awareness might be far more fundamental to the universe than we've imagined. Your individual consciousness wouldn't be an accidental byproduct of complex matter, but rather a localized expression of something that's woven into the very fabric of reality. Some interpretations suggest that the observer effect in quantum mechanics points toward consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex brains. If consciousness is required for quantum wave function collapse, then awareness might be as basic to the universe as space, time, and energy. Dr. Amit Goswami has proposed that consciousness is the ground of all being, the fundamental reality from which both matter and mind emerge. In his framework, what we think of as physical matter is actually consciousness taking temporary form. Your brain doesn't create awareness. Rather, consciousness uses your brain as a temporary vehicle for experiencing itself in individualized form. This is naturally highly speculative and far from scientific consensus, but it offers a framework for understanding consciousness that sidesteps many of the problems that have plagued materialist approaches to awareness. As you listen to these possibilities, notice how they might shift your perception of your place in the universe. Instead of being a temporary arrangement of matter that somehow generates awareness, you might be a localized expression of consciousness itself, temporarily experiencing individuality within a fundamentally unified field of awareness. There's something that happens when you sit quietly with these possibilities about consciousness beyond the brain. The familiar world doesn't disappear, but it begins to shimmer with mystery. The coffee cup on your table, the sound of traffic outside your window, the sensation of breath moving through your body, all of these ordinary experiences become doorways into questions that stretch across the cosmos. What if the awareness that's reading these words right now isn't confined to the space inside your skull? What if it's part of something vast, ancient, and eternal that expresses itself through temporary individual forms? What if your consciousness is like a unique note in an infinite symphony, contributing its own irreplaceable melody while never being separate from the music itself? These aren't questions that can be answered through conventional scientific methods, at least not yet. They point toward aspects of reality that might always remain partially mysterious, partially beyond the reach of objective measurement. But they're also questions that transform the very experience of being conscious. Dr. Thomas Nagel, a philosopher at NYU, has argued that consciousness poses such a fundamental challenge to materialist science that it might require entirely new forms of understanding. Not just better theories or more sophisticated equipment, but conceptual frameworks that we haven't yet learned to imagine. The possibility of consciousness beyond the brain doesn't negate the importance of neuroscience or the reality of brain function. Your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions clearly correlate with neural activity. Damage to the brain affects consciousness in predictable ways. The discoveries of neuroscience remain valid and important, but these correlations might not tell the complete story. Just as a radio doesn't create the electromagnetic waves it receives, your brain might not create the consciousness it expresses. Instead, it might serve as a sophisticated biological instrument for focusing, modulating, and expressing patterns of awareness that exist independently. This perspective doesn't diminish the significance of your individual experience. If anything, it makes every moment of consciousness more precious, more connected, more meaningful. Your thoughts and experiences wouldn't be isolated events in a single brain, but rather contributions to an ongoing cosmic conversation about the nature of existence itself. If consciousness truly extends beyond individual brains, the implications ripple through every aspect of human understanding. Death would no longer represent the absolute termination of awareness, but rather a transition, like a wave returning to the ocean, or a song finishing its melody while the music continues. This doesn't necessarily mean personal survival in the way religious traditions often describe it. Your memories, your personality, your individual story might not continue intact, but the fundamental awareness that you are, the consciousness that observes thoughts and experiences emotions, might be part of something that transcends individual lifetimes. Your relationship to others would also transform if consciousness is fundamentally interconnected. Competition and conflict would still occur at psychological and social levels, but they would unfold within a deeper context of unity and connection. Helping others would become a form of helping yourself, not through ethical obligation, but through recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. The environmental crisis might also look different if consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. Instead of being accidental products of evolutionary processes on one small planet, humans might represent one of the ways that cosmic consciousness becomes aware of itself and takes responsibility for its own flourishing. Your care for the natural world, your concern about climate change, your desire to protect other species might reflect the universe caring for itself through temporary human form. Environmental action would become not just ethical responsibility, but cosmic self-care. Even your daily experiences of beauty, love, and meaning might take on new significance. If consciousness operates through universal fields of awareness, then your moments of wonder, your experiences of connection, your search for truth and purpose would all be ways that the cosmos explores and appreciates its own nature. Consider how this might appear in the simple moments of your life. The way sunlight falls across your wall in the morning, the feeling of connection when you look into another person's eyes, the sense of peace that sometimes arises in quiet moments. If consciousness extends beyond individual brains, these experiences might represent moments when your personal awareness aligns with deeper currents of meaning that flow through reality itself. While scientists develop increasingly sophisticated tools for studying consciousness, there's one laboratory that's always available to you: your own direct experience. Every moment offers opportunities to investigate awareness from the inside, to notice features of consciousness that might not be visible to external observation. This isn't about believing particular theories or accepting specific frameworks. It's about looking carefully at what's actually present in your own experience, rather than relying on assumptions about what should be present. Start with something simple. Notice that you're aware right now. Not what you're aware of, but the fact that awareness itself is present. Can you find the edges of this awareness? Can you locate its center? Does it seem to be inside your head, or does the experience of having a head appear within awareness? Many people, when they begin to investigate awareness directly, discover that it's far more spacious and mysterious than they initially assumed. The boundaries between self and world, between observer and observed, between inner and outer, often prove to be much more fluid than ordinary thinking suggests. Dr. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and meditation teacher, describes discovering through contemplative practice that the sense of being a separate self is actually an illusion. Not a useful illusion that should be maintained, but a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of consciousness itself. According to Harris and many other contemplative practitioners, careful examination of direct experience reveals that there's no actual center to consciousness, no separate observer looking out at the world. Instead, there's just awareness itself, open and present, in which all experience appears without any separate experiencer. This doesn't necessarily prove that consciousness exists independently of brains, but it suggests that even the most basic assumptions about the nature of awareness might be open to revision through careful investigation. Take a moment to explore this in your own experience. As thoughts arise and pass away, can you find the thinker? As emotions flow through awareness, can you locate the one who feels them? As sensations appear and disappear, can you identify the observer? The more closely you examine consciousness, the more it seems to resemble what contemplative traditions have long described. Not a thing or an entity, but an open space of awareness in which all experience appears, but which itself remains transparent, ungraspable, mysterious. Dr. Richard Davidson's laboratory at the University of Wisconsin has spent decades studying how contemplative practices affect brain function, and the results suggest that consciousness might be far more malleable than we've traditionally assumed. Long-term meditation practitioners show enhanced activity in brain regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and compassion. But they also show changes that seem to extend beyond anything that could be explained by neural plasticity alone. Experienced meditators often report accessing states of consciousness that feel more fundamental than ordinary waking awareness, more spacious than personal identity, more connected than individual isolation. They describe discovering dimensions of awareness that don't seem to be produced by brain activity, but rather seem to be revealed when certain mental processes quiet down. Dr. Judson Brewer has found that as the default mode network, those brain regions associated with self-referential thinking becomes less active during meditation, practitioners often report expanded states of consciousness rather than diminished awareness. It's as if the quieting of certain neural networks allows access to dimensions of consciousness that are normally obscured. This pattern appears across contemplative traditions, whether through meditation, prayer, or other practices. People consistently report discovering aspects of awareness that seem to transcend individual identity and connect them to something larger than personal consciousness. These experiences remain subjective and can't be directly verified through external measurement, but their consistency across cultures and individuals suggests that consciousness might indeed have dimensions that extend beyond ordinary brain-based awareness. Consider what this might mean for your own potential for transformation. If consciousness is more fundamental and expansive than we've traditionally assumed, then your capacity for growth, healing, and awakening might be far greater than you've imagined. The practices that reveal these expanded states of consciousness aren't complex or esoteric. They often involve simply learning to be still, to pay attention, to notice what's already present rather than constantly seeking something new. The laboratory of awareness is always available, requiring only patience and careful attention. One of the most profound implications of consciousness beyond the brain might be the healing of what philosophers call the mind-body split. For centuries, Western thought has treated consciousness and physical reality as fundamentally separate categories. Mind and matter, subject and object, observer and observed have been seen as distinct realms that somehow interact but remain essentially different. But if consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if awareness is woven into the fabric of reality itself, then this split begins to dissolve. Mind and matter would be different aspects of a deeper unity, like two sides of the same coin, or waves and water in the ocean. Dr. David Chalmers, who coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, has increasingly moved toward panpsychist perspectives that treat consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality rather than something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter. In this view, your awareness wouldn't be separate from the physical world, but would be the inner aspect of physical processes. Every quantum interaction, every electromagnetic field, every gravitational wave would have both external measurable properties and inner experiential qualities. This doesn't mean that rocks and rivers have human-like consciousness, but rather that consciousness and physical reality are two aspects of something deeper that underlies both. Your rich, complex awareness would emerge from the integration of countless simpler forms of consciousness, just as a symphony emerges from the integration of individual notes. Take a moment to consider how this might shift your relationship to the physical world. Instead of being a conscious observer separate from an unconscious universe, you would be consciousness temporarily taking individual form within a cosmos that is itself aware, alive, creative. The trees outside your window, the stars overhead, the ground beneath your feet, all would be expressions of the same fundamental reality that expresses itself as your awareness, not identical to your consciousness, but continuous with it, like notes in an endless cosmic song. As we approach the limits of what can be said about consciousness beyond the brain, it's important to acknowledge the profound mysteries that remain. We're dealing with questions that push against the very boundaries of human understanding and perhaps even human comprehension. The mechanisms by which consciousness might operate independently of brains remain completely unknown. We have no direct evidence for quantum fields of awareness, holographic information storage, or universal consciousness. The theories we've explored are speculative frameworks that attempt to make sense of puzzling phenomena, but they remain far from established scientific fact. Even if consciousness does extend beyond individual brains, we don't know what this would mean for personal identity, memory, or individual experience. The continuation of awareness beyond physical death might be so different from current consciousness that it wouldn't represent personal survival in any meaningful sense. The interconnectedness of individual minds might operate through mechanisms so subtle that they rarely influence daily experience in noticeable ways. The access to universal information might be so filtered through individual neural networks that it provides no practical advantage for solving personal or collective problems. These uncertainties aren't reasons to dismiss the exploration of consciousness beyond the brain. They're reminders that we're dealing with profound mysteries that require intellectual humility, careful investigation, an openness to possibilities that might transform our understanding of reality itself. What we do know is that consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries facing science. Despite decades of research and billions of dollars in funding, we're no closer to understanding how mere matter gives rise to inner experience than we were a century ago. This mystery isn't a problem to be solved through better technology or more sophisticated theories. It might be a fundamental feature of reality that requires expanding our conception of what's possible, what's real, and what it means to be aware. Dr. Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, observed that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Perhaps the mystery of consciousness reflects not just the limitations of our current scientific methods, but the inherent mystery of existence itself. As we drift toward the end of this exploration, the fundamental question remains beautifully open. Does consciousness exist beyond the brain? We've encountered compelling evidence that challenges materialist assumptions. We've explored theories that suggest awareness might be fundamental rather than emergent. We've considered implications that would transform our understanding of identity, death, and connection. But the question itself might be more important than any particular answer, because in asking whether consciousness extends beyond the brain, we're really asking who we are, what we're capable of becoming, and how we relate to the mystery of existence itself. Your own direct experience remains the most immediate laboratory for investigating these possibilities. Every moment offers opportunities to examine the nature of awareness, to notice features of consciousness that might not be visible to external observation. The stillness that's always present beneath the surface of mental activity. The observer that witnesses thoughts and emotions without being touched by them. The sense of connection that sometimes arises between minds. The moments of inspiration that seem to come from beyond individual memory and imagination. Whether these experiences point toward consciousness beyond the brain or simply reveal features of brain-based awareness that we don't yet understand, they transform the very experience of being conscious. They invite wonder, humility, and a deeper appreciation for the mystery of awareness itself. As you continue your own exploration of consciousness, remember that you're participating in one of the most profound investigations possible. Not just studying consciousness, but being consciousness investigating itself. Not just asking questions about awareness, but awareness questioning its own nature. This investigation doesn't require special equipment, advanced degrees, or access to laboratories. It requires only the willingness to look carefully at your own experience, to question assumptions that seem obviously true, and to remain open to possibilities that might transform everything you thought you knew about reality. The mystery of consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. Whether awareness extends beyond the brain or not, the fact that there's anything it's like to be you remains one of the most extraordinary features of existence. And in this moment, as these words arise in your awareness, as understanding unfolds in the space of consciousness that you are, the mystery continues to reveal itself. Not through final answers or complete explanations, but through the ongoing wonder of being aware. If consciousness does exist beyond the brain, then everything you know about reality is indeed wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being false or worthless, but incomplete in ways that open up infinite possibilities for understanding, connection, and awakening. And if consciousness is generated entirely by brain activity, then the emergence of awareness from mere matter remains so mysterious, so extraordinary, that it transforms the very meaning of what it is to be matter, to be brain, to be human. Either way, the mystery deepens, the wonder expands, and consciousness continues to explore itself through every moment of your experience. As we close this gentle exploration, consider one final possibility that weaves together everything we've discovered. Perhaps the question of whether consciousness exists beyond the brain is like asking whether a dream exists beyond the dreamer. In dreams, you experience rich, complex worlds that seem to extend beyond individual minds. Complex worlds filled with characters, landscapes, and experiences that feel entirely real while you're experiencing them. Yet when you wake, you realize that everything in the dream emerged from the same unified source, the same dreaming consciousness. The mountains and valleys, the people you met, the conversations you had, all arose within a single field of awareness. The dream characters didn't exist separately from the dreamer, yet they seemed to have independent lives, thoughts and purposes while the dream unfolded. Perhaps consciousness and the physical universe have a similar relationship. Maybe what we call individual minds are like dream characters in a cosmic dream, each experiencing themselves as separate while actually arising within a unified field of awareness that dreams the entire cosmos into being. In this view, your brain wouldn't create consciousness any more than a dream character's imagined brain creates the dream. Instead, consciousness would be the fundamental reality, the cosmic dreamer, temporarily experiencing itself through countless individual perspectives throughout space and time. This is, of course, a metaphor rather than a scientific theory, but it captures something profound about the relationship between individual awareness and universal consciousness that many contemplative traditions have pointed toward for millennia. As you rest in this possibility, notice how it might shift your relationship to this very moment. The awareness that's present right now, listening to these words, considering these ideas, wondering about the nature of reality itself. This awareness that you are might be far more mysterious, far more connected, far more significant than you ever imagined. Whether consciousness extends beyond the brain through quantum fields, holographic information structures, or universal awareness, or whether it emerges entirely from neural processes we don't yet understand, one thing remains undeniably true. The fact that there's anything it's like to be you represents one of the most extraordinary features of existence. Every moment of conscious experience, every thought that arises, every emotion that flows through awareness, every sensation that appears in the field of consciousness is part of an ongoing mystery that science is only beginning to explore. Dr. Max Planck, the physicist who helped birth quantum theory, once observed that consciousness cannot be separated from the observer. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. This doesn't prove that consciousness exists beyond the brain, but it reminds us that awareness is intimately woven into the very fabric of investigation itself. We are consciousness studying consciousness, awareness exploring awareness, mystery investigating mystery. As you drift deeper into rest tonight, whether you're settling into sleep or simply allowing your mind to become quiet and still, remember that you're participating in something profound. Not just having conscious experiences, but being the consciousness in which all experience appears. The questions we've explored together, the possibilities we've considered, the mysteries we've touched all arise within the same awareness that's present right now. This awareness that reads these words, that contemplates these ideas, that wonders about its own nature. Whether this awareness is generated by your brain or received by it, whether it's individual or universal, whether it persists beyond physical death or dissolves into something larger, it remains the most intimate and immediate aspect of your existence. More certain than any scientific theory, more present than any philosophical framework, more real than any explanation. And in recognizing this, in simply noticing the awareness that's always present, you participate in consciousness coming to know itself. Not through complex theories or sophisticated instruments, but through the direct recognition of what you most fundamentally are. The mystery continues, the exploration deepens, and consciousness keeps discovering itself through every moment of your experience, whether it extends beyond the brain or not, whether it's individual or cosmic, whether it's temporary or eternal. It's here now, aware now, present now. And that presence, that awareness, that consciousness that you are, might just be the most profound truth accessible to human understanding. Take a final moment to consider the implications of everything we've explored together. If consciousness truly extends beyond individual brains, then every human being who has ever lived might be like a unique book in an infinite cosmic library. Each life, each perspective, each moment of awareness contributing its own irreplaceable chapter to the ongoing story of consciousness exploring itself. Your own life, your own experiences, your own unique way of being aware would be an essential part of this cosmic narrative, not just a temporary accident of neural chemistry, but a necessary expression of consciousness investigating its own nature through temporary individual form. The thoughts you're thinking right now, the emotions you felt today, the moments of wonder and curiosity that brought you to this exploration, all would be ways that the universe comes to understand itself more completely. This perspective doesn't diminish the reality of suffering, loss, or the very real challenges of human existence, but it places these experiences within a context that's both humbling and inspiring. Every moment of consciousness, whether pleasant or difficult, would contribute to the ongoing evolution of awareness itself. As you continue your own exploration of consciousness, whether through contemplative practice, scientific study, or simply careful attention to direct experience, remember that you're participating in the most fundamental investigation possible, the investigation of reality by reality itself. The question of whether consciousness exists beyond the brain will likely remain open for years to come, but the exploration itself, the wondering, the careful examination of experience, the openness to possibilities that challenge our deepest assumptions, this exploration transforms the very experience of being conscious. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery of consciousness is not meant to be solved, but lived, not explained but experienced, not understood but embodied. As you rest in the quiet space of awareness that's always present, as you notice the stillness that underlies all mental activity, as you recognize the consciousness that you are, you participate in the most profound activity possible. Consciousness recognizing itself, awareness becoming aware of awareness, mystery investigating mystery. Whether this recognition reveals consciousness beyond the brain, or simply illuminates the extraordinary nature of brain-based awareness, it transforms everything. Because it reminds us that consciousness itself, the very fact that there's anything it's like to be, remains one of the most beautiful mysteries in existence. And in this moment, as these words complete their journey from one awareness to another, as understanding unfolds in the space of consciousness that you are, the mystery continues to reveal itself. Not through final answers or complete explanations, but through the ongoing wonder of being aware. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller. May your rest be deep, your awareness spacious, and your wonder endless. The cosmos continues its ancient conversation with itself, and you're both its voice and its listening ear. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity about the mysterious relationship between consciousness and reality, you might find yourself drawn to another puzzle that bridges the gap between mind and cosmos. In Quantum Dreams, the secret code your brain uses to communicate with you, we'll discover how your sleeping mind might be tapping into quantum processes to create the rich, impossible worlds you experience each night. Until next time, rest well in the mystery of being aware. Aware. As consciousness slowly fades from our immediate grasp, something extraordinary begins to emerge from the spaces between certainty and mystery. In these quiet moments where science meets wonder, where the measurable dissolves into the ineffable, we find ourselves at the edge of what it means to be aware. The implications of consciousness beyond the brain don't simply challenge neuroscience. They whisper toward a fundamental reimagining of what conversation means, what connection looks like, and how awareness might participate in the very unfolding of reality itself. Dr. Francisco Varela, a neuroscientist who spent his later years exploring the intersection of contemplative practice and scientific inquiry, described what he called participatory knowing. This isn't knowledge that you acquire about consciousness. It's knowledge that emerges through consciousness recognizing itself in the very act of investigation. In this participatory framework, the boundary between observer and observed begins to soften. You're not studying consciousness as an external object. You're consciousness exploring its own nature through the temporary form of scientific inquiry. Every measurement, every theory, every moment of wonder becomes a way that awareness investigates itself. Consider how this might appear in the research we've explored together. When scientists document synchronized brain activity between distant individuals, they're not just measuring electromagnetic fields or neural oscillations. They're potentially witnessing consciousness recognizing itself across apparent separation. When contemplatives report accessing states of awareness that transcend individual identity, they're not just having subjective experiences. They might be discovering dimensions of consciousness that exist beyond the boundaries of personal perspective. When quantum physicists encounter the observer effect and find consciousness woven into the very foundations of physical measurement, they're not just uncovering mathematical relationships. They might be approaching the recognition that awareness and reality are far more intimately connected than materialist science has assumed. There's something profound that begins to emerge when you consider consciousness not as an individual possession, but as an ecology, an interconnected web of awareness that includes but extends far beyond individual minds. Dr. Andreas Weber, a biologist and philosopher, has developed what he calls the ecology of mind. In his framework, individual consciousness exists within nested systems of awareness that operate at multiple scales. Your personal awareness participates in family systems, community networks, cultural currents, and potentially cosmic patterns of consciousness that extend throughout space and time. This ecological perspective helps explain phenomena that remain mysterious within purely individualistic frameworks. Why do certain insights seem to emerge simultaneously in multiple minds? Why do emotional atmospheres spread through groups in ways that transcend verbal communication? Why do collective experiences sometimes generate states of coherence that individuals rarely access alone? If consciousness operates ecologically, then your individual awareness would be like a unique ecosystem within a vast biosphere of consciousness, distinct in its particular characteristics, but never separate from the larger patterns of awareness that surround and include it. Take a moment to sense this in your own experience. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice the quality of awareness that's present. Does it feel contained within the boundaries of your individual perspective? Or does it feel more spacious, more connected, more participatory in something larger than personal identity? The ecological metaphor also suggests that consciousness, like biological ecosystems, might be far more resilient and adaptive than we typically assume. Individual minds might come and go, but the larger patterns of awareness they participate in continue to evolve, learn, and express themselves through countless temporary forms. This doesn't diminish the significance of individual experience. If anything, it makes every moment of personal awareness more precious because it represents a unique contribution to an ongoing cosmic conversation about the nature of existence itself. Dr. David Loy, a Buddhist scholar who's explored the intersection of contemplative wisdom and ecological thinking, suggests that the environmental crisis might reflect a fundamental misunderstanding about the boundaries of self and world. If consciousness is ecological rather than individual, then caring for the natural world becomes a form of caring for the larger patterns of awareness that include and transcend personal identity. As we drift deeper into these possibilities, we encounter something that might be called the architecture of wonder. Those moments when the ordinary world suddenly reveals depths of mystery that transform the very experience of being conscious. You've probably experienced this yourself, perhaps while watching sunlight move across a wall, or gazing at stars on a clear night, or simply sitting in quiet stillness. Suddenly the familiar becomes luminous. The ordinary reveals extraordinary depths. The boundary between self and world becomes transparent, and awareness recognizes something vast and beautiful about its own nature. These experiences aren't accidents or anomalies. They might be glimpses of how consciousness naturally operates, when the usual mental filters relax their grip. Moments when the ecological nature of awareness becomes temporarily visible, when the participatory quality of consciousness reveals itself. Dr. David Chalmers has observed that consciousness seems to have what he calls a revelatory quality. It doesn't just process information, it illuminates information, makes it meaningful, transforms data into the lived experience of understanding. This revelatory aspect of awareness might point towards something fundamental about how consciousness participates in the unfolding of reality itself. Consider the difference between artificial intelligence processing language and your experience of understanding these words right now. The AI can recognize patterns, generate responses, and perform complex computations. But there's no inner light of comprehension, no felt sense of meaning unfolding, no wonder at the mystery of communication itself. Your consciousness doesn't just process the information in these sentences, it illuminates them, makes them meaningful, transforms abstract concepts into felt understanding. This revelatory quality of awareness might be more than just a subjective add-on to information processing. It might be a fundamental feature of how consciousness participates in the cosmos. If this revelatory aspect of awareness operates beyond individual brains, it might help explain why the universe seems to be structured in ways that allow for understanding, beauty, and meaning. Not because these qualities were designed into reality, but because consciousness and cosmos co-evolve together in an ongoing dance of revelation and discovery. One of the most intriguing questions raised by consciousness beyond the brain involves what researchers call subtle influence. If awareness operates through quantum fields, morphic resonance, or other non-local mechanisms, how might individual consciousness participate in larger patterns of change and evolution? This remains highly speculative, of course, and no scientific consensus exists around these possibilities. But some researchers have documented intriguing correlations that hint at connections between consciousness and collective human behaviour that extend beyond conventional explanations. Dr. Dean Radin has conducted studies suggesting that periods of global meditation or prayer sometimes correlate with temporary reductions in random fluctuations in electronic devices, as if focused collective attention creates subtle coherence in the electromagnetic environment. The Global Consciousness Project has documented statistical anomalies in their worldwide network of random number generators during events that capture widespread human attention. While the effects are subtle and the interpretation remains controversial, they point toward the possibility that collective consciousness might have measurable influences on physical systems. As our gentle exploration draws to a close, we find ourselves in that liminal space where questions become more beautiful than answers. We've drifted together through evidence that challenges our deepest assumptions, through theories that stretch the boundaries of imagination, through possibilities that transform the very meaning of what it is to be aware. The question of whether consciousness exists beyond the brain remains magnificently unresolved. But perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Because in asking this question, in sitting with its implications, in allowing it to transform our relationship to awareness itself, we've discovered something profound. We've found that consciousness, whether brain-bound or cosmic, remains the most intimate mystery we'll ever encounter. Your awareness, reading these words right now, contemplating these possibilities, wondering about its own nature, is participating in the universe's ongoing conversation with itself. And in that participation, in that wondering, the mystery deepens, the exploration continues, and consciousness keeps discovering itself through every moment of your experience.